Welcome to The Secret Mind. I was just going to do a quick video today to balance the long video of yesterday, and that's exactly what I just did, and managed to not get the microphone correct. So I'm going to have to do it again. Do I have to do it again? We're reading this book. I know nobody cares about it, but by God, we are going to get through to the end of this. And I can tell you, having now read the chapter, murder is afoot. So you would imagine that second time around there'll be fewer mistakes, but I'm guessing there might be slightly more. Let's do this. It's getting interesting, guys. Sign up. I always do that, every single time. Every man an enemy. By the way, sorry about the lack of facial decorum. Would you believe I'm growing it for a part? I may shave it off and stick a fake one on. 2 months is a long time. Every Man an Enemy by W. Howard Baker, a Sexton Blake thriller. Chapter 7. Prout hit the typewriter keys with a final derisive clatter as the thudding began again under the bare-boarded floor of his room. That was Mrs. Moneylove, his landlady, that was. He could picture her, so fat that she wobbled like jelly, whenever she moved, her tiny eyes like holes in a snowbank blazing with hate. She'd be sprawled on her back on her groaning bed in the room below him, pounding at the flaking ceiling above her with a long-handled broom. 2 minutes after 10 o'clock, and she was at it. Bang, bang, bang. Prout slipped the release on his paper bale of his typewriter and jerked top copy carbon paper and black out of the old battered machine. As Mrs. Moneylove banged again, making the upturned box he was sitting on twist, buck and jump, he yelled, "All right, all right!" He was coldly angry. What a place. The thudding stopped, and he got to his feet, glowering at the spot on the bare boards beneath which he imagined Mrs. Moneylove to be. 2 minutes after 10, and she gave him no peace. He went across the room, dragging his feet, intentionally making more noise than was necessary. "Rotten old hay bag," he muttered beneath his breath. He swung out his hammock from its home on the floor near the door. He unrolled it, every movement vicious. He slung the hammock from 2 hooks, one on either side of the narrow, bare, unfurnished room. He tossed his blankets into it. Then he came back across the room to move the typewriter from its box and to drag out a plastic plate and a chipped cup and make himself some supper. His eyes fell on the work he'd just finished. He picked up the top sheet and looked at it. Slowly, his anger evaporated. This was good. He'd written it, and it was good. Very good. A chapter and a half of first-class copy. He went through it slowly and carefully, his preparations for supper forgotten, Mrs. Moneylove forgotten. His eyes slid through typed sentences and his characters lived, breathed, and spoke in his mind. He had said exactly what he'd wanted to say. He'd written precisely what he'd wanted to write. He got up, forgetful of everything. Mrs. Moneylove, his surroundings, his supper. He began to pace the floor, deep in thought, intent on what would come next in his novel. Soon, he made an urgent move towards his typewriter. He must get this down. Then he checked himself as full realization of the circumstances and his surroundings returned. He couldn't use his machine. Not after 10 o'clock. Mrs. Moneylove didn't like it. He swore under his breath. He knew what she would be doing at this precise moment, as surely as if he could see her. She'd be propped up in bed on big, soft, yielding pillows in the room below him, and she would be reading. "Any night, 10 o'clock, you'll always know where to find me," a coy, simpering look that had curdled his blood. "I'll be reading me books." In her own words, she was a great reader. As she had explained to him when he'd first sought a room here, and inexplicably they'd ended up surrounded by the cloying little girl femininity of her bedroom for the final details to be thoroughly settled. I've no use for the telly at all. Well, it's all women prancing about and high-kicking and that. Another coy, simpering look, and a nudge that had nearly knocked him off balance and onto the broad, super-soft bed. Well, I mean to say, if there ever had been a Mr. Moneylove, he was long dead, or long disappeared. Mrs. Moneylove, Prout had gathered, had lived here for years with a succession of lodgers for whom she had not one kind word to spare. But she'd never mentioned a husband at all. Instead, she had regaled him with the plots of the books she had just enjoyed, relating them in considerable detail and at crushing length. Paul Rennin's Street Woman and Sinners in the Sun, Darcy Glinto's Lady Don't Turn Over. Ever such good books they were, she breathed, quiveringly close to him, and smelling strongly of ashes of roses, a transparent nylon nightie thrown carelessly over the bed. Oh, and you say you're a writer? I bet you've been around, eh? With a leer. I always think writers must lead such interesting lives. He'd taken the bed-sitting room, which was on offer without hesitation. It had been so cheap and so comfortable. Then. It had only been later, after declining invitation upon invitation to look at her library, that items of furniture had begun to disappear from his room one by one. The easy chair had gone first. It's got a cracked leg. I'll want to talk to you about it. Come on down any time. But he hadn't. The table had gone next. It's got a wobbly top. Look who was talking. I'm trying to mend it. You might come down some nights and give me a hand. Then the carpet had gone. No comment this time. And the bed. Finally had come the embargo. No typing after 10 o'clock and the bang, bang, bang on the floor. Prout glowered at his thoughts. He made a half-hearted attempt to stir himself into fierce anger again, and he failed. What was the use? He knew what this was all about. He supposed their next move would be to put the rent up. He thought about that. This bare, unfurnished room was his home, the only home that he had. If he persisted in thwarting Mrs. Moneylove, it would be not his home for very much longer. What should he do? He didn't know whether she could actually turn him out into the street if every other stratagem failed, or whether she couldn't. He had no conception of the legal position. All he knew was that he paid very little for this room and could afford to pay no more for another. He sighed a low, lingering sigh. Mrs. Moneylove could make life exceedingly difficult for him if she wanted to. Hadn't she already started? If things continued this way, he'd soon find that he couldn't work here, and then, whether she actually turned him out or whether she didn't, he'd have no alternative. He'd have to go. And where could he go? Where could he take his typewriter and live for nearly next to nothing and work, if not here? But what was he worrying about? If everything went according to plan, all his pleasant troubles would soon be over. He'd have the money from Innes for 6 pillows to midnight, and he'd be able to offer him another novel at once, a worthy successor. Soon, if everything went well, he'd have all the money he was ever likely to need and the kind of surroundings, friends and clothes that went with it. He'd have a flat overlooking the park, a big flat. He'd buy a car, write at an inlaid desk, dress well, go to nightclubs, dine in style. Dine in style. His expression was almost wistful now. He went across the room to the box which served him as table and cupboard. He bent his long legs and squatted down in front of it. Dine in style. He found 2 dried-up old onions and a thick hunk of half-stale bread. He found a little fresh milk still left in his half-pint bottle, and he poured it into a saucer for Mrs. Moneylove's ginger cat. With the cat he had no quarrel, despite the fact that it seemed to hate him. He crossed the room and set the saucer down outside his door. Out there in the darkness 2 green eyes regarded him balefully. Tiddle's green eyes. The bitter green eyes of his landlady's cat. Every night, Prout gave it milk. And every night, the cat looked at him as though he was its worst enemy. Unfailingly. It wouldn't move towards the saucer and milk until he was back in his room and the door once more closed. It never did. Not tonight, nor any other night. From inside his room, from the other side of the tight closed door, Prout could hear it attacking the milk, Clatter, clatter, bang, went the saucer. Prout thought it was strange that no cat liked him, and no cat did. All were allergic to him for some peculiar reason. All hated him, even when he went out of his way to be kind to them, as he often did. Prout shrugged. Back before his box, he uncovered the coagulated mess of cocoa and sugar and condensed milk which, with the bread and cheese, would constitute his own supper. Someone had once told him that a man could live indefinitely on this diet. The man had almost spoken the truth. Almost. But not quite. The diet had everything in the body that the body demanded, except variety. And there were times, and this was one of them, when Prout felt he'd rather die the slow, lingering death of starvation than face this horrible meal once again. He looked at it. He swallowed. He closed his eyes. Then, unwillingly steeling himself to do it, he began to eat the porridgey mess. The first mouthful was the worst, but if you pretended, the nausea, the sickness of sameness, soon passed. He bit into an onion. Chicken, he said. He tore at the hunk of bread. Turkey. On the floor beside him lay the evening's work, 1.5 chapters of copy, 1.5 chapters of his novel. Good stuff. Outside the room, beyond the cracked window, the lights of London tinted the dark night sky. Gay lights, bright lights, the lights which represented life and luxury, when he was rich. Bending forward with a piece of bread, he scooped up some of the sticky mess of cocoa and condensed milk and sugar. It looked revolting, but he had to eat it. He just had to. He was hungry. Caviar, said Prout. The bright lights, the gay lights of London, how they sparkled and shimmered and shone. Along Regent Street and Oxford Street, the pavements were crowded and the workshop windows ablaze with messages of Christmas cheer. In Piccadilly, the night was mad with popping and spiralling reds, blues and greens. Off the bright circus, in alleyways and cul-de-sacs, smaller neons, some discreet, some blatant and screaming, advertised the presence of clubs and of pubs. Prout saw the lights wistfully as an alluring glow in the distant December sky, and longed to be a part of the whirring, pulsating, expensive life they decorated. The money he dreamt of would have given him the entree he desired. Jimmy Mackintosh, on the other hand, ex-Major Mackintosh, the last of the claimants to authorship of 6 Pillows to Midnight, was already part of the glittering world of which Prout dreamed. The money Jimmy Mackintosh coveted was to enable him to stay there without effort. Both Mackintosh and Prout then had the love of bright lights in common, and both had laid claim, with 3 others, to the authorship of an undoubted bestseller. Both wanted the money recognition would bring. But there, all similarity ended. Prout was young and impoverished and a hard worker. Mackintosh was none of these things. Prout had had to make his own way in the world, and it had been a long and hard journey not yet concluded. Mackintosh had had almost everything done for him. Prout had been unfortunate from the moment of his birth in an East End slum. Ill luck had seemed to dog him. Nothing he'd ever done turned out quite right straight away, but he'd gone on trying. Mackintosh had been the only child of doting parents, and it had made him selfish, egotistical and single-minded in one important particular. The world owed him a living. Everything which had happened to Jimmy Mackintosh throughout the 40 years of his life, from his days at public school and university, through a career in the regular army, to his discharge under a cloud a few months earlier, had only served to strengthen him in this conviction. The world did owe him a living, and not just a living of any old kind. It had to be one of the best. The Ritz, the Savoy, the Dorchester, the Hilton, these were common words in his vocabulary. He faced the future with established and expensive tastes, no wish to work, and some alarm. He had to consolidate his claim to have written 6 Pillows to Midnight. He had to. If he didn't, he would have to find himself some kind of a job. He'd have borrowed off every friend he'd ever had and was rapidly running through his list of casual acquaintances. Without some money from Innes, and soon, his future looked simply appalling. Puttering over London in a taxi, Bound for a nightclub, a hangover, and this week's girlfriend, Mackintosh coldly weighed and assessed the chances of every claimant, including himself. He'd met them all, and frankly, he didn't know how Harvey Innes was going to choose to be swapped between them. He tried to work this out now. He tried to anticipate the moves that Innes would make and plot out a series of counters to them. He leaned back in the cab and closed his eyes the better to concentrate. He thought of all the claimants. He created their images in his mind one by one. There was Prout, and Lavinia Webb, and Asbury, and there was that strange man, that zombie, the man whose name was Fawcett, but whom he'd heard Kirby privately call the man with the 7 o'clock face. Thinking about all the claimants, visualizing them, Jimmy Mackintosh started with him. The man with the 7 o'clock face pushed himself up off his bed in Bermondsey. His thoughts had been far away. Now they must return to reality. He sighed and stretched. He went across the room and began to straighten the typewritten sheets of paper on the table by the window. He'd do no more work tonight. He'd slipped the cover of his battered old typewriter. The rest of the week's output could wait until tomorrow. He crossed the room again as a knock sounded on his door. He found his supper tray awaiting him on a table in the passage. He picked it up and brought it into his room, kicking the door shut behind him. The tray carried biscuits and hot chocolate. As usual, the chocolate was too hot to drink immediately. The cup was almost too hot to handle. He put it down to cool and returned to tidying up his papers. A sentence in the topmost sheet of typescript caught his eye, and he stopped. For a moment he just stood there, his gaze still dead and empty, but his mouth curved in something very like a smile. He admired his own craftsmanship and his technique, but above all, he marvelled at his guile. The begging letter he was looking at was a lovely piece of work. He had to give himself credit. He'd excelled himself. The man the letter was addressed to, the suffragan Bishop of Chalesford, would be unable to resist it. He'd pay up. A fiver was the very least he could send. And his letter was so touching, so heartrending, even that His Grace the Bishop would get a warm Christian glow just out of parting with good money. The thought pleased the man with the 7 o'clock face. For years he'd made a living by bombarding with begging letters the mansions and palaces of the great, and he had always taken a conscious pride in his work. It was true that there was a school of thought amongst begging letter writers that the literary standard of the product didn't matter, that illiteracy had even greater virtues, in fact. But with this proposition, the man with the 7 o'clock face could not agree. If a job was worth doing at all, he'd always reasoned, it was worth doing well. Besides, he liked to feel that after reading his work, the recipients of his letter wanted to part with their money. He liked to feel that in some subtle way he was making the world a happier, brighter place. Many do-gooders spent the greater part of their lives searching for lost causes to champion. So wasn't he achieving something if he cut short this search and provided them with a first-class lost cause dear to his own heart? Himself. With these thoughts in his mind, he had laboured at creating a style. From the very first sentence to the last, he set a mood of sorrowful resignation which harrowed and mortified his readership. He was never aggressive, as some of the other begging letter writers of his acquaintances were. He never blustered. He told a sad tale in a tragic way, and he cut the cloth of each story to fit the figure of a carefully selected recipient. He took care with his work, and he took a pride in it. Not for him the slapdash mass circulation aimed at by others. He liked to think that only the very best people read letters of his, and he considered the fact that he wrote to a man at all should be deemed in some way to be a seal upon that man's success. Still smiling, he finished straightening his papers. He nibbled a biscuit. Still smiling, he reached for the cup of chocolate and found it cool. He sipped it. It was rather more bitter than usual tonight. His landlady hadn't put enough sugar in it. He liked a lot, and she stinted him sometimes. It had happened before. Now he ladled 3 heaped spoonfuls of sugar into the cup from his private store and took another sip of the chocolate. Better now, very much better. He drank the dark, thick liquid slowly, savouring the flavour. It was as he set the empty cup down that he felt the first slight tremors of unease. Something was wrong. And then swiftly a strange feeling began to flood through his limbs. It was a kind of numbness. It puzzled him. His mind was detached from his body. It was as if he were drunk. He sat down, suddenly upon his bed. He had to sit down. He felt giddy. The strange numbness persisted. It grew stronger. What was the matter? He was alarmed. He was beginning to pant now. He was having difficulty in getting his breath. He was more than alarmed. He was terrified. He tried to get up. He was ill. He must get help. He tried to get onto his feet and reach the door. He never did. His legs refused to bear his weight. They buckled beneath him. He fell heavily and he couldn't rise. There was pain now, burning pain, which began as a small hot glow in the pit of his stomach and expanded rapidly, agonizingly. He opened his mouth to cry out, but no sound came. With the empty chocolate cup on the table full in his sight, with the dawning realization of what had happened in his eyes, a rattle began in his throat. He had been poisoned, and he was dying. These were the very last thoughts which screamed through his mind. He had been poisoned, and he was dying. After they passed through his brain, there was nothing. Nothing at all. The next moment, the man with the 7 o'clock face was dead. See you tomorrow.